August 17, 1858. The Royal Canal, Mullingar, County Westmeath, Ireland. Constable Michael Farrell stands at the edge of Lock 34, staring at something that defies every instinct in his 23 years of police work. A pair of mute swans, birds known for their grace and indifference to human affairs, circle a specific stretch of towpath with unusual aggression. For 6 consecutive days, these birds have attacked only one man, the same man, every single time he passes. Thomas Brennan, the assistant lockkeeper, bleeds from fresh wounds on his forearms. The swans hiss and beat their powerful wings, refusing to let him near the water's edge. Other pedestrians walk freely past. Children toss breadcrumbs. But when Brennan approaches, the birds transform into sentinels of fury. "They know something," an elderly woman whispers to the constable. "Animals always know." Farrell dismisses her superstition, but 3 days later, when workers drain Lock 34 for seasonal maintenance, they discover why the swans had been so vigilant. At the bottom of the lock, weighted down with canal stones and wrapped in oilcloth, lies the decomposing body of Margaret O'Donnell, missing for 17 days. The swans had been nesting just 12 feet from where her body lay submerged. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in Mullingar could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Mullingar Lockkeeper'S swans and the murder that shocked Victorian Ireland, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers all around the world. Ireland in 1858 existed in the shadow of catastrophe. The Great Famine had ended barely a decade earlier, leaving the country's population decimated, from over 8 million to just over 6 million souls. Mullingar, a market town in the Irish Midlands, had survived better than most coastal regions. But the psychological scars remained fresh. Trust had become a luxury. Neighbors eyed neighbors. The social fabric that once held communities together had frayed beyond recognition. The Royal Canal, completed in 1817, ran 146 kilometers from Dublin to the River Shannon, cutting directly through Mullingar. By the 1850s, railway expansion had begun to diminish canal traffic, but the waterway remained vital for transporting turf, grain, and livestock. Lock 34, situated on the western edge of Mullingar, marked a critical point where the canal descended toward Lough Owel. The lock required constant maintenance, and the lockkeeper's cottage stood as a lonely sentinel overlooking dark, still waters. James Brennan had served as lockkeeper at Lock 34 for 19 years. A widower in his late 50s, he lived a quiet, methodical life defined by water levels, gate mechanisms, and the occasional barge passing through. His son Thomas, aged 28, had joined him as assistant lockkeeper in 1856 after failing to find steadier work in Dublin. The two men maintained the lock with Germanic precision, their cottage garden immaculate, their records without error. Thomas Brennan cut an unremarkable figure in Mullingar society. Average height, brown hair thinning at the temples, soft-spoken to the point of timidity. He attended Sunday Mass at the Cathedral of Christ the King with mechanical regularity. He drank moderately at Greville's public house on Friday evenings, never causing trouble, rarely drawing attention. Shopkeepers described him as pleasant enough and reliable with his debts. The local parish priest, Father Donal O'Malley, considered him a model parishioner, if somewhat distant and lacking in warmth. Margaret O'Donnell had arrived in Mullingar in March of 1858, one of thousands of young women seeking domestic work in the post-famine economy. 22 years old, from County Mayo, she possessed the fierce independence common to those who had survived the hunger years. She secured a position as a housemaid for the Hartley family, Protestant merchants who owned the grain warehouse near the canal. Margaret walked the same route each Thursday, her half-day off, from the Hartley residence on Patrick Street, along the canal towpath, to visit her cousin in Ballymahon. The towpath took her directly past Lock 34. Witnesses would later recall seeing Margaret and Thomas Brennan in conversation on multiple occasions. Brief exchanges, they said, nothing improper. He would tip his cap. She would nod politely. The social distance between a Catholic housemaid and a lockkeeper's son remained appropriate, maintained with Victorian propriety. But something in those encounters had caught like a thorn. On July 29, 1858, Margaret O'Donnell left the Hartley residence at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for her regular Thursday walk. She never arrived at her cousin's home. She was never seen alive again. The initial search proved perfunctory. Young women disappeared with distressing frequency in post-famine Ireland. Emigration to America, elopement, or simply walking away from impossible circumstances. The Royal Irish Constabulary filed the requisite report. Mrs. Hartley expressed concern but hired a replacement within the week. Margaret's cousin sent inquiries to Mayo, thinking she might have returned home. Life in Mullingar continued its measured rhythm. The canal waters flowed. Barges passed through Lock 34. Thomas Brennan operated the gates with his usual efficiency, and the Swans began their vigil. The first attack occurred on a Tuesday morning, witnessed by barge captain Samuel Hughes and his crew of 3. Hughes had been navigating the Royal Canal for 16 years and knew Lock 34 intimately. As his vessel entered the lock chamber, he observed Thomas Brennan approaching the gates to begin the standard operating procedure. What happened next violated everything Hughes understood about animal behavior. A mating pair of mute swans, resident at Lock 34 for the past 4 seasons, erupted from their nesting site along the north bank. The male swan, called a cob, launched himself at Brennan with wings fully extended, spanning nearly 8 feet. The impact drove Brennan backward into the towpath railing. The female, the pen, joined the assault, pecking viciously at Brennan's hands as he raised them in defense. "I've seen swans protective of their nests," Hughes would later testify. "They'll hiss and posture, but this was different. This was targeted, intentional. They weren't defending territory, they were attacking the man specifically. The assault lasted nearly 4 minutes. Brennan sustained lacerations to both forearms and a significant bruise across his chest. The Swans only retreated when James Brennan, Sr., emerged from the cottage with a canal pole, creating enough distance for Thomas to escape indoors. The peculiar detail that Hughes emphasized: the Swans showed no aggression toward anyone else. Hughes himself had walked past their nesting site just moments before. His crew operated the lock gates without incident. Children played along the towpath that very afternoon, tossing bread to the Swans, who accepted the offerings with their typical serene indifference. Thomas Brennan remained inside the cottage for the rest of the day, his father managing the lock operations alone. 2 days later, Thomas Brennan attempted to resume his duties. The results proved even more disturbing. Constable Michael Farrell happened to be conducting his regular patrol of the canal when he witnessed the second attack. His official report, preserved in the Westmeath County Archives, provides clinical documentation. At approximately 10:45 hours, I observed Assistant Lockkeeper Thomas Brennan exit his residence and proceed toward the southern lock gate. Before he had traveled 20 paces, both swans departed the water with unusual speed and coordinate. Movement. The male swan struck Mr. Brennan about the head and shoulders, while the female targeted his lower extremities. Mr. Brennan fell to the ground, attempting to shield himself. The attack continued for approximately 3 minutes until I intervened with my baton, driving the birds back to the water. Farrell noted several peculiarities. First, the swans had not been near their nest when the attack began. They had been feeding on the opposite bank, nearly 40 yards distant. Second, they appeared to track Brennan's movements with unnatural focus. Third, and most unsettling, the moment Brennan retreated inside the cottage, the swans returned to their normal behavior, gliding peacefully across the lock's surface. It was as if they were waiting for him, Farrell wrote in his report, specifically him. The constable, a pragmatic man shaped by years of rural police work, included a final observation that would later prove significant. Mr. Brennan appeared more distressed by the attacks than warranted by his physical injuries. His hands trembled severely. He refused to meet my eyes during our conversation. When I asked if he had done anything to provoke the birds, he became visibly agitated and insisted he had done nothing wrong. The choice of words struck me as peculiar, as I had only inquired about the swans. By the third attack, word had spread through Mullingar. Curious onlookers gathered along the canal to witness the phenomenon. What they saw that Saturday afternoon would be discussed in Westmeath pubs for decades. Thomas Brennan, perhaps attempting to prove his courage or simply desperate to perform his duties, approached the lock at midday. James Brennan followed 10 paces behind, ready to intervene. A crowd of approximately 30 people lined the towpath and bridge. The swans attacked with such ferocity that even hardened canal workers flinched. The male swan struck Brennan's face, opening a cut above his left eye. The female swan beat her wings against his torso with sufficient force to crack a rib. Brennan fell, covering his head, while his father and 2 onlookers drove the birds away with sticks and canal poles. "They know he's done something," old Bridget Malone announced to the crowd. At 73, Bridget represented the last generation to remember the old ways, the folk knowledge that predated Catholic orthodoxy. "Animals see what we can't, They sense guilt like blood in water. Several witnesses reported that after the attack, while Brennan was being helped to his feet, the Swans positioned themselves between the man and the water's edge, blocking his access, guarding something. Father O'Malley, present in the crowd, attempted to restore rationality. The birds are merely protecting their nesting territory, he insisted. This superstitious talk helps no one, but even the priest couldn't explain why the Swans permitted everyone else to pass unmolested. Children fed them bread crusts. Women drew water from the canal. Barge crews operated the lock gates. Only Thomas Brennan triggered the attacks. The fourth incident brought Constable Farrell back to Lock 34, this time accompanied by Dr. Edmund Walsh, the town physician. Walsh, a Trinity College graduate with distinctly modern sensibilities, had agreed to observe the situation in hopes of providing a medical explanation. Thomas Brennan, bandaged and bruised, was persuaded to approach the lock once more. For scientific observation, their necks extended in aggressive posture, their wings half raised. Dr. Walsh, watching through his medical lens, made an observation that would prove prophetic. The birds are exhibiting protective behavior, but not of their nest. They're protecting something in the water, something they don't want disturbed. After the attack ended, Constable Farrell remained at the lock watching the Swans. For the next hour they circled the same section of water repeatedly, the area near the northern bank, where the lock's stone wall met the deeper channel. They dipped their heads beneath the surface. They agitated the water with their feet. They maintained their vigil with unwavering focus. That evening, Farrell filed a request with the Royal Irish Constabulary headquarters in Dublin for permission to drain Lock 34 for inspection. He couldn't articulate exactly what he suspected. He possessed no evidence of wrongdoing. But 23 years of police work had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct screamed that Thomas Brennan was hiding something beneath those dark waters. The approval came through on August 17th. The truth was about to surface. If this story's giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. August 17th, 1858. 6:30 a.m. The draining of Lock 34 begins under overcast skies that mirror the tension gathering along the canal. Constable Farrell has assembled a team, 2 canal workers, Dr. Walsh, Father O'Malley present to administer last rites if needed, and a representative from the Royal Canal Company. Thomas Brennan has been conspicuously absent since dawn. His father claims he's taken ill. The Swans watch from the southern bank, their white forms stark against the gray water. The lock operates on a simple principle: open the lower gates, allow the water to flow downstream, expose what lies beneath. Canal worker Patrick Doherty operates the mechanism he's operated 1,000 times before. The iron gates swing open with their familiar groan. Water begins its exodus. The process takes 3 hours. As the water level drops, the Swans become increasingly agitated. They circle the shrinking pool, calling out with their harsh trumpeting cries, a sound mute swans typically reserve for extreme distress. The male swan repeatedly attempts to enter the draining lock chamber, only to retreat when confronted by the exposed stone walls and decreasing water depth. At 9:47 a.m. Patrick Doherty sees it. "Mother of God," he whispers, crossing himself. Near the northern wall, where the water has receded to approximately 2 feet, something pale protrudes from beneath a carefully arranged pile of canal stones. The stones are smooth, rounded, clearly placed there deliberately. The pale object is fabric, oilcloth, stained with algae and degradation. Constable Farrell descends the iron ladder into the lock chamber, his boots finding purchase on the slick stone bottom. Dr. Walsh follows. The water, now barely ankle-deep, carries the fetid smell of organic decomposition. "Everyone else stays up," Farrell orders. His hands shake as he begins removing stones. 1, 2, 12, 23. Each stone had been selected for weight, for size. Someone had taken considerable time to ensure whatever lay beneath would remain submerged. The oilcloth bundle measures approximately 5 feet in length. Farrell recognizes the material. Standard canal worker's tarp, used for protecting cargo during transport. His mind catalogs details with practiced efficiency even as his stomach revolts against what he knows he's about to find. Dr. Walsh produces a medical kit from his bag. "We must proceed methodically," he says, though his voice wavers. "Proper documentation is essential." Farrell cuts the rope binding the oilcloth. The fibers are swollen with water, resistant to his knife. He works slowly, carefully, aware that a crowd has gathered on the bridge above, that Father O'Malley is murmuring prayers in Latin, that the Swans have gone silent. The oilcloth falls away. Margaret O'Donnell stares at nothing with clouded eyes. Her body, preserved by the cold canal water and lack of oxygen, remains largely intact. She wears the same gray dress she was last seen in on July 29th, 19 days ago. Her hands are bound behind her back with canal rope. Her mouth is packed with cloth, likely to muffle screams. But what draws Farrell's immediate attention, what makes Dr. Walsh audibly gasp, is the evidence of strangulation. Deep bruising encircles her throat in a pattern that Walsh will later identify as consistent with manual strangulation. Hands, not rope. The killer had looked into her face while he choked the life from her body. Time of death would be difficult to establish precisely, Dr. Walsh says, slipping into clinical detachment as doctors do when confronted with horror. But based on decomposition and the date of disappearance, I would estimate she's been here between 15 and 20 days. The cold water has significantly slowed degradation. Farrell climbs back up the ladder, his legs weak. The crowd has swelled to nearly 100 people. Word spreads through Mullingar with the speed that only tragedy achieves. The constable's eyes scan the gathering until he finds James Brennan standing at the rear, his face gray as ash. "Where is your son, James?" The elder Brennan's mouth opens, closes, opens again. He's inside. He's been ill since when, James? Since the Swans started attacking him, since I requested the lock be drained?" Farrell pushes through the crowd toward the Lockkeeper'S cottage. Behind him, Father O'Malley begins administering last rites over Margaret O'Donnell's body. The Swans, as if released from their vigil, glide toward the cottage side of the canal, their duty finally complete. The cottage door stands open. Thomas Brennan is gone. On the kitchen table, Farrell finds a ledger, the daily operational record for Lock 34. He flips through pages of meticulous handwriting, water levels recorded to the inch, barge passages documented with times and cargo descriptions. Everything orderly, everything precise, until he reaches July 29th. The entry for that day reads, "No passages, lock gates required adjustment. Afternoon spent on maintenance." But beneath this official entry, in smaller script, almost invisible unless you're looking for it, Thomas Brennan had written something else. Something he'd tried to scratch out but hadn't quite erased. "God forgive me, God forgive me, God forgive me." In a drawer, Farrell discovers Margaret O'Donnell's identification papers, a small prayer book with her name inscribed inside, and a locket containing a photograph of an elderly couple, likely her parents in Mayo. Trophies, kept hidden, evidence of a darkness that Thomas Brennan couldn't quite abandon. Dr. Walsh completes his preliminary examination at the lock's edge, Margaret's body now covered with a clean sheet someone has provided. His official statement, delivered to the gathered crowd in a voice stripped of emotion, confirms what everyone already knows. This woman was murdered, strangled manually, then concealed in the lock with deliberate intent to hide the crime. The condition of the body and the manner of concealment suggest premeditation and significant physical effort. This was not a crime of passion, but of calculation. The Swans, their vigil ended, settle onto the canal bank. The male preens his feathers while the female tucks her head beneath her wing. They have done what they could do. They had tried to warn. Animals always know. The manhunt for Thomas Brennan lasted 6 days, mobilizing resources from 3 counties and revealing a trail of deception that extended far beyond the drowning of Margaret O'Donnell. Within hours of discovering Margaret's body, Constable Farrell dispatched telegrams to every Royal Eyrie Estabulary station within a 50-mile radius. The description went out: Thomas Brennan, age 28, approximately 5 feet 8 inches, brown hair, soft-spoken, likely traveling on foot with limited resources, armed with a detailed physical description, and the knowledge that Brennan had no known friends outside Mullingar. Authorities established a perimeter focused on railway stations, canal boats, and coaching inns. The investigation quickly revealed that Thomas Brennan had been planning his escape for at least 3 days. Shopkeeper Cornelius Murphy reported that Brennan had purchased traveling provisions on August 14th, dried beef, hardtack, a new pair of boots. "He told me he was planning a walking tour," Murphy testified. "Said he needed to clear his head after the business with the Swans. I thought nothing of it." Marie Costello, proprietor of Costello's boarding house, came forward with more disturbing information. On the evening of August 15th, 2 days before the lock was drained, Thomas Brennan had appeared at her establishment requesting accommodation for a friend arriving from Dublin. He'd paid in advance for 3 nights and requested that the room be held regardless of whether the friend arrived. When Costello entered the room on August 18th, she found it empty except for a packed traveling bag containing civilian clothes, money, and a falsified letter of reference claiming Brennan was a clerk seeking work in Cork. He was building escape routes, Detective Inspector William Crawford concluded after arriving from Dublin on August 19th. Crawford, a veteran of the constabulary with 15 years investigating serious crimes, took command of the investigation with methodical intensity. He knew this was coming. The question is, how long has he known? While constables tracked Brennan's movements, Crawford ordered a complete search of the Lockkeeper'S cottage. What they discovered painted a portrait of a man whose inner life bore no resemblance to his public persona. Beneath a loose floorboard in Thomas Brennan's bedroom, investigators found a leather-bound journal. The entries, spanning 3 years, documented an escalating obsession with control, power, and the vulnerability of women traveling alone on the Canal towpath. Crawford would later describe the journal as the most disturbing document I have encountered in my career, though he refused to read selected passages aloud in open court, deeming them too obscene for public record. What can be shared, the journal revealed that Brennan had been watching Margaret O'Donnell for months, documenting her Thursday walks with minute precision. He knew her schedule, her route, her approximate return time. On July 29th, the journal entry was brief. It is decided. God will judge if he cares. More chilling were references to previous opportunities missed and lessons learned from failed attempts. Crawford immediately ordered a review of all missing person reports filed in Westmeath over the previous 5 years, with particular attention to young women who had disappeared near the canal. Also discovered in Brennan's room, Margaret's missing shawl, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, and a sketch, crude but recognizable, of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Catherine Byrne, a housemaid who had disappeared near Lock 34 in April 1856. Her body had never been found. James Brennan, when confronted with these discoveries, collapsed. "I didn't know," he repeated. "I swear on my wife's grave I didn't know." The elder Brennan's grief appeared genuine, but Crawford wasn't satisfied. How could a father live in such close proximity to his son and remain blind to such darkness? The investigation would later reveal that James Brennan suffered from partial deafness, a consequence of working around lock gates for 2 decades, and had increasingly relied on Thomas to manage night operations. Thomas had enjoyed unsupervised access to the lock and towpath for hours. Each day, opportunities to kill had been abundant. Thomas Brennan was captured near Mowate, approximately 15 miles east of Mullingar, attempting to board a coaching service bound for Dublin. A stable boy named Peter Quinn, who had seen the wanted notices posted in the village, recognized Brennan despite his attempt to disguise himself with a false beard and spectacles. "He was sitting in the corner of the public house drinking whiskey and staring at nothing," Quinn testified. "His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the glass. When I approached to ask his name, he looked at me and I swear I saw relief in his eyes, like he'd been waiting to be caught." Constable James Malloy, stationed in Moat, arrested Brennan without incident. Brennan offered no resistance, no denials. When Malloy informed him he was being charged with the murder of Margaret O'Donnell, Brennan's response was telling. "Just the one?" The question hung in the air like poison. During the transport back to Mullingar, Brennan spoke freely, too freely. In the presence of Constable Malloy and a witness, Dr. Patrick Hennessy, present to ensure the prisoner's fitness for travel, Brennan confessed not only to murdering Margaret O'Donnell but hinted at other victims. "The Canal keeps secrets," he said, "deep, dark secrets. Check the locks, check them all." These statements, later deemed admissible despite questions about Brennan's mental state, would prove crucial in the subsequent trial. The trial of Thomas Brennan commenced at the Westmeath Assizes on November 3, 1858, before Justice Robert Warren. The prosecution, led by Crown Solicitor Edward Murphy, presented a case built on physical evidence, witness testimony, and Brennan's own damning journal entries. The trial lasted 12 days and drew spectators from across Ireland. Every seat in the courthouse was filled. Crowds gathered outside to hear second-hand reports. The case had captured public imagination, not just because of the murder itself, but because of the Swans. Newspapers from Dublin to Cork ran headlines about the birds that knew evil and nature's witnesses to murder. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Dr. Walsh testified to the cause of death, manual strangulation, and the estimated timeline. The physical evidence, rope, oilcloth, stones, matched materials found at the Lockkeeper'S cottage. Margaret's personal effects discovered in Brennan's room established possession of her property. But the journal provided the most damning evidence. Justice Warren permitted selected passages to be read in court, though he ordered the gallery cleared of women and children for these portions of testimony. The entries revealed a mind consumed by violent fantasies, a man who viewed women not as human beings but as objects over which to exercise power. Witnesses testified to Brennan's behavior in the days following Margaret's disappearance. Mrs. Hartley recalled him asking, with apparent innocence, whether Margaret had turned up yet. He had attended her memorial mass at the cathedral, sitting in the back pew, offering prayers for her safe return. The Swan attacks became a point of peculiar legal consideration. The defense, led by barrister Thomas O'Brien, attempted to argue that the attacks had driven Brennan to temporary insanity, that the stress had forced him to flee, that his confession was unreliable. But this strategy crumbled when the prosecution demonstrated that the attacks began only after Margaret's body was hidden in the lock. The Swans weren't causing Brennan's guilt, they were responding to it. Dr. Francis White, an alienist early psychiatrist called by the defense, examined Brennan and declared him of sound mind, fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions. The attempt to plead insanity failed. On November 15, 1858, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of willful murder. Justice Warren, in sentencing Thomas Brennan to death by hanging, delivered a statement that newspapers would quote for decades. "You have shown yourself to be a man devoid of conscience, a predator who exploited the trust of your community, and the vulnerability of an innocent young woman. The evidence suggests Miss O'Donnell may not have been your only victim. While you stand convicted of one murder, I suspect you will answer to God for others." Thomas Brennan was hanged at Mullingar Gaol on February 14, 1859, before a crowd of over 2,000 people. Public executions in Ireland typically drew large audiences, but this one achieved particular notoriety. The symbolism, a killer executed on Valentine's Day, was not lost on contemporary observers. Father O'Malley attended Brennan in his final hours, hearing his confession and administering last rites. The contents of that confession remained sealed under canonical law, but Father O'Malley's public statement afterwards sent shockwaves through the investigation. "Thomas Brennan has confessed to crimes beyond the one for which he was convicted. I am bound by the seal of confession, but I can say that authorities should investigate the disappearances near the Royal Canal with renewed attention. Not all victims may yet be found." Following this revelation, Detective Inspector Crawford ordered the draining and search of 6 additional locks along the canal where young women had disappeared between 1855 and 1858. The operation, conducted over 3 weeks in March 1859, yielded horrific results. At Lock 27, near Killucan, they discovered the remains of Catherine Byrne, missing since April 1856. Her body, weighted with stones in the same manner as Margaret O'Donnell's, had been concealed in a section of the lock accessible only to someone familiar with canal operations. At Lock 38, they found partial skeletal remains later identified through dental records and clothing as belonging to Ellen Riley, a traveling seamstress who had disappeared in August 1855. No evidence was found at the other 4 locks searched, but Crawford believed the absence of evidence didn't mean absence of victims. "The canal is 146 kilometers long," he noted in his final report. "We cannot drain it all. God alone knows what still lies beneath." James Brennan, shattered by his son's crimes and the revelation that Thomas had been killing for years, died of a stroke on April 2, 1859. He was found in the cottage at Lock 34, a whiskey bottle in his hand, having drunk himself to unconsciousness. The official cause of death was apoplexy brought on by extreme distress. The unofficial verdict whispered in Mullingar pubs, "A man who died of shame." The Lockkeeper'S cottage at Lock 34 was demolished in May 1859. The Royal Canal Company declared it irredeemably tainted and built a new cottage 50 yards downstream. Lock 34 itself was redesigned. The northern bank where the Swans had nested was filled in, changing the lock's profile forever. The Brennan case exposed significant failures in law enforcement and social oversight. How had a serial killer operated for years along a well-traveled canal without detection? The answer, uncomfortable but honest, lay in the vulnerability of working-class women in post-famine Ireland. Margaret O'Donnell, Catherine Byrne, Ellen Riley, all were young women traveling alone, without family protection, seeking work in an economy that offered them few choices. When they disappeared, initial investigations were perfunctory. The assumption, unspoken but pervasive, was that these women had simply moved on, emigrated, or made poor choices. The Dublin Evening Post published a scathing editorial on March 7, 1859. "The murders at Lock 34 reveal not just the depravity of one man, but the failure of our society to value the lives of our most vulnerable citizens. These women deserve better protection. They deserve better investigation when they vanished. They deserve to be seen as victims, not statistics." The case prompted reforms in how the Royal Irish Constabulary handled missing person cases. New protocols required immediate investigation of any disappearance, regardless of the victim's social class. Canal companies were required to hire lockkeepers in pairs, ensuring no single employee had unsupervised access to isolated sections. But perhaps most significantly, The case entered Irish folklore as a cautionary tale about the gap between public respectability and private monstrosity. Thomas Brennan had been pleasant enough, reliable, a model parishioner. His darkness had been invisible, until animals, creatures operating on instinct rather than social convention, exposed it. The Mullingar Swan murders, as they became known, reverberated through Victorian society far beyond County Westmeath, raising uncomfortable questions about criminal psychology, animal cognition, and the blind spots in social structures that allow predators to thrive. Thomas Brennan represented an archetype that would become disturbingly familiar in the century that followed, the seemingly normal man whose inner life concealed profound pathology. Dr. Francis White, the alienist who examined Brennan, published a monograph in 1860 titled On the Concealment of Criminal Insanity in Persons of Otherwise Orderly Habits. The work, considered groundbreaking for its time, argued that certain individuals possessed the capacity to compartmentalize their violent urges, maintaining functional public lives while nurturing secret depravities. Mr. Brennan attended Mass on the very Sunday after murdering Miss O'Donnell, White wrote. He operated the lock gates with precision. He conversed with neighbors about weather and commerce. This capacity for dissociation suggests a fundamental disconnect between conscience and action, not insanity in the legal sense, but a moral void that permitted him to view his victims as less than human. White's analysis predated, by decades, the formal study of psychopathy, yet his observations align remarkably with modern understanding of antisocial personality disorder. Brennan exhibited the classic markers: superficial charm, absence of remorse, ability to mimic appropriate emotional responses while feeling nothing genuine, and a view of other people as objects to be manipulated or destroyed. The case prompted broader examination of how respectable exteriors could conceal murderous intent. In the 1860s, similar cases emerged across Britain and Ireland: the Northumberland poisonings of 1862, the Edinburgh boarding house murders of 1864, each involving perpetrators who had successfully masqueraded as upstanding citizens while systematically killing the vulnerable. These cases collectively shattered Victorian assumptions about the visible nature of evil. Criminals weren't just the obviously degenerate, the poor and desperate, the physically marked by vice. They could be anyone. They could be your neighbor, your employee, the quiet man who tipped his hat and attended church. This realization fundamentally altered approaches to criminal investigation. Detective Inspector Crawford, writing in his memoir, 20 Years in the Irish Constabulary, 1873, reflected, "The Brennan case taught us to distrust appearances. We learned to investigate what lay beneath respectability, to question the stories we were told, to recognize that the most dangerous predators are often those who blend most successfully into normal society." The behavior of the Mullingar Swans sparked intense scientific interest that continued well into the 20th century. How had the birds known? What had they sensed that human observers missed? Dr. Edmund Walsh collaborated with ornithologist Dr. James Stirling of Trinity College Dublin to study the incident from a zoological perspective. Their jointly authored paper, On the Apparent Discrimination Capabilities of Cygnus olor 1860, examined several hypotheses. Swans possess sensitive olfactory capabilities. It's possible that the birds detected chemical changes in Brennan's stress hormones, elevated cortisol, adrenaline markers excreted through sweat, that became associated with the disturbance near their nesting site when he disposed of Margaret's body. Each subsequent approach by Brennan would trigger recognition of that scent profile, prompting defensive aggression. Swans are highly intelligent birds with sophisticated pattern recognition. They may have observed Brennan's behavior on July 29th, perhaps witnessed him weighted down with something heavy, moving furtively, disturbing the water near their nest. This memory could have created a lasting negative association with the individual specifically. Swans are attuned to vibrations through water. The decomposition process produces gases and chemical changes that might have created subtle vibrations or water disturbances detectable by the birds. Brennan's approach might have agitated them not because of what he was, but because his proximity reminded them of the disturbing presence in the water beneath their nesting site. Walsh and Stirling concluded, while we cannot definitively explain the swans' behavior, the preponderance of evidence suggests these birds were responding to genuine environmental cues rather than supernatural perception. The appearance of animal intuition likely reflects sensory capabilities that exceed our own, operating on information invisible to human observers. Modern behavioral scientists examining the case have proposed additional explanations involving stress-related micro-expressions, gait changes associated with guilt and fear, and the possibility that Brennan unconsciously avoided the section of water where he'd hidden the body. Behavioral avoidance that the territorial Swans interpreted as threat. Regardless of the mechanism, the Mullingar case contributed to growing recognition that animals process environmental information in sophisticated ways that can supplement human investigation. Police forces in several European countries began using dogs not just for tracking but for behavioral assessment of suspects, recognizing that animals often react to cues humans consciously overlook. The Brennan murders exposed brutal truths about whose lives mattered in Victorian Ireland. All three confirmed victims, Margaret O'Donnell, Byrne, Ellen Riley, were young, unmarried, working-class women with limited family connections. They traveled alone. They lacked the protection of male relatives. They moved through society's margins, visible enough to be targeted but invisible enough to be dismissed when they vanished. Historian Dr. Siobhan O'Neill, in her 1978 book, The Vulnerable Class, Working Women in Post-Famine Ireland, examined the Brennan case within the broader context of violence against women. These murders succeeded for years because society had already decided these women didn't matter enough. Initial investigations into their disappearances were cursory. Families lacked resources to push for answers. The assumption, unspoken but pervasive, was that young women from this class simply disappeared sometimes. Perhaps they emigrated. Perhaps they fell into prostitution. Perhaps they made bad choices. No one imagined murder because no one valued them enough to imagine they were worth murdering. The case prompted women's advocacy groups, nascent in the 1860s but growing, to demand better protection for female workers. The Irish Women's Reform League, founded in 1860, cited the Mullingar murders as evidence that women needed legal reforms. The right to travel with police protection in dangerous areas, mandatory investigations for missing persons regardless of class, and employment protections requiring multiple staff at isolated work locations. Some reforms succeeded, most didn't. The full recognition that violence against women constituted a social crisis requiring systemic response would take another century. The Royal Canal Company faced significant legal liability following the Brennan revelations. Families of victims filed civil suits arguing that the company's employment practices, allowing single lockkeepers unsupervised control of isolated sections, created environments where predation could flourish. The most significant case, O'Donnell v. Royal Canal Company, 1861, resulted in a landmark verdict. The court ruled that while the company couldn't have predicted Brennan's specific crimes, they had failed to implement reasonable safeguards for public safety. The judgment required the company to employ lockkeepers in minimum pairs at all locations, install emergency bells at regular intervals along towpaths, conduct background investigations of all employees with unsupervised access to the public, maintain regular patrol schedules by company supervisors. These reforms spread beyond Ireland. Canal companies throughout Britain adopted similar protocols. The case established legal precedent that companies operating public infrastructure owed a duty of care to travelers, even when the threat came from their own employees. Mullingar struggled with how to remember the murders. The lockkeeper's cottage was demolished, but the lock itself remained operational. Should it be renamed? Should there be a memorial? Who should be remembered? The killer who put the town on the map, or the victims who deserved better? In 1862, a group of Mullingar women commissioned a small memorial stone placed near where Lock 34 once stood. The inscription read simply, "In memory of Margaret O'Donnell, Byrne, Ellen Riley, and others unknown. They deserved better. We failed them." The phrasing, "we failed them," represented a collective acknowledgement of societal culpability. The murders weren't just Thomas Brennan's fault. They were enabled by social structures that rendered certain women invisible and disposable. The memorial stone remained in place until 1921, when it was destroyed during the Irish War of Independence, collateral damage in a conflict that had nothing to do with its purpose. It was never rebuilt. Today, Lock 34 no longer exists in its original form. The canal was largely abandoned in the mid-20th century, later partially restored as a recreational waterway. Few people walking the towpath near Mullingar know what happened there, but the case lives on in Irish folklore, in the stories grandmothers tell grandchildren about trusting your instincts, about how animals sometimes know what humans refuse to see, about the darkness that can hide behind respectable faces. The Brennan case ultimately reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. We want to believe evil is recognizable, that monsters look like monsters. Thomas Brennan proved otherwise. He looked like everyone else. He sounded like everyone else. Until he didn't. We want to believe institutions protect the vulnerable. The reality, institutions often protect themselves first and the vulnerable last. We want to believe justice is blind, equally applied. The reality, Margaret O'Donnell, Byrne, and Ellen Riley received minimal attention when they disappeared because society had already decided they didn't matter enough. And perhaps most haunting, we want to believe we would have seen the signs, that we would have known. But Thomas Brennan's neighbors didn't know. His father didn't know. His priest didn't know. The Swans knew. What does it say about human perception that animals recognize danger before people did? What does it say about our social structures that we ignored women's disappearances until their bodies literally surfaced? The Mullingar Swan murders don't offer comfortable answers. They offer only the cold comfort of evidence that when society fails to protect its vulnerable members, predators thrive in the gaps between what we claim to value and what we actually protect. What do you think drove Thomas Brennan to commit such calculated acts against innocent women? Was it the isolati? On of the Lock Cottage, the power imbalance between a local man and vulnerable travelers, or something darker? A fundamental emptiness where conscience should have resided. And what about the Swans? Can we truly explain their behavior through science alone? Or does their vigil represent something we still don't fully understand about the natural world's response to human violence? Leave your theories in the comments below. This case raises questions that remain relevant more than 160 years later, about how we recognize evil, how we protect the vulnerable, and whether we're paying attention to the warnings all around us. If this story affected you, consider that women still disappear, still face violence, still navigate a world where being vulnerable can be deadly. The faces change, the names change, the fundamental failures of protection remain disturbingly familiar. Subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost chapters of history. The stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about who we were, and perhaps who we still are. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an investigation into the darkness that hides in plain sight. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the truth surfaces when we finally look beneath the placid waters we've been ignoring. See you in the next video.